Hey Michael, how are you?
Good, man. How you doing?
Let's get into that. How am I doing?
Let's get
If there
into
was
it.
ever call it good news, bad news of timing to talk about climate.
Mm,
So 6 weeks ago, I announced that I was selling my place in Atlanta
hmm
to move to Asheville and split my time between Asheville and North Carolina. That was like the plan, right? So we literally moved from Atlanta, drop our stuff in Asheville, spend the night, and promptly get on a plane for Northern California.
mm.
And then 2 weeks later, the hurricane hits. Fortunately, where my house is and everything, like still no water, but clearly I've been in the flow of everything from FEMA conversations to, for me, obviously the bias is like kind of the civil engineering breakdown of things. And then, of course, we had this other storm, Milton, coming right through, getting ready to pound Tampa. And then we have a segment of the population is like, what climate? What climate change is what's going on?
First of all, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry to hear that. And I was thinking about you during that horrific storm. We used to say like what it was like once in a generation. Now it's once every year, every couple of years. I mean, no, not Nashville specifically, but I think the thing that I think of, KP, when you bring that up, it's a lot of us that are like deeply passionate and committed to climate tech, as you are, as I am.
Mm-hmm.
I'm following your lead as always, um, and terrified about the climate crisis. I think for a lot of us, just maybe speaking personally, we're detached from the physical impact of it because
Mm-hmm.
I live in the north. I live in New Jersey. Yeah, we haven't had rain in a long time. When we do get rain, it's sort of flash flooding, but roads don't go out. I think talking to you today and hearing your experience, I think it sort of for those of us like me that are disconnected from it physically,
Mm-hmm.
it brings it back really to reality and to home, and it kind of like makes it a little bit more intimate and real
Mm-hmm.
that the shit is just it's happening, right?
Right. And so this is where, and this is a conversation I want to have with you. We'll let other people listening into the conversation. Have we now reached a tipping point in climate where the idea of climate prevention, the idea that the scientists have talked about, hey, there's going to be a tipping point where there's nothing else we can do, like preventative wise. Should we be shifting all our resources, like forget about carbon credits and all this other fake accounting stuff, that's going on, and oh, we can prevent this, and let's create new types of concrete, and should we be putting all that effort to responding to climate change versus this idea of preventing climate change? Because that's where my mindset is right now. Because I'm like, why are we funding all these companies that are going to hopefully lower degrees, 1 degree, and like that? Like maybe it's a foregone conclusion that we're down. It's we've hit the tipping point, and let's put all of our resources towards kind of simulation reaction, and we're maybe done with prevention.
Mm. I think you're right. Um, and thinking about, talking to you today, which I always enjoy, my friend, and I always learn so much. So I hope this is more me listening than talking. I was thinking about, okay, so I'm going to connect with KP today, and I'm looking forward to it. And I was like, you know, the conversation probably needs to steer along the lines of what you just said, which is, right, energy management, great, important, you know, measuring carbon impact, important, relevant. But should we really be talking about like mitigation as best we can, if there's such a thing? And who better, right, than you, because you spent your career on the AEC side. And I think that's where it really needs to go. We need to start talking about whatever mitigation there is. And
Hmm.
it's going to be physical, right? It's going to be construction, it's going to be materials, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So where does your mind go now in terms of tech and embodied carbon and mitigation and resiliency as
Yeah.
best we can?
Okay. So here's where my head goes. Right. My First year of college as a civil engineer, we
Mm,
take this thing called engineering ethics. And it's an entire semester with one purpose, like to convince us that there is a value of life, that there is a dollar amount as engineers that we set. There is not an infinite value to life the way we engineer. And I remember my professor saying, this is this is circa 1989, right? For context, for some of our younger viewers, 1989. The question my professor asked us was, do you think we should design an arena to withstand the impact of a 747?
wow.
And had us go down that path of what it would cost to design an arena to understand that impact, right? And then we do all this, and then he's like, okay, well, what are we going to design for? And he's like, well, this is what reasonably we have to design for to make it economically feasible. And this is, at Georgia Tech, so I'm in Atlanta. He's like, well, we understand the busiest airport in the world is 5 miles away from the Hawks Arena. Shouldn't we be designing for an 747 to run into it? And we're like, well, that doesn't seem reasonable. So now we're talk about, the 30,000 people in that arena. What's their life worth,
Mm,
right? So now you start getting this worth of life, and that's what came to mind was like, oh my god, like what is life worth, right? And now we're in Asheville in Western North Carolina. Search and rescue is really like corpse recovery right now, right? So the body count. So then, so that's where my head immediately went to. And so there's, and someone can fact check me and tweet me that I'm wrong, but it's what I've read so far is that there's three water treatment plants that serve that market. All three are down.
mm,
Two are completely gone.
God.
There's no fixing. This is like, let's go build water treatment plants as fast as we can. What, in a year? And that's assuming government and money and like all those things. Maybe it's still like you can only do so much, right? Now, the third one that's down, this is fascinating, right? Civil engineering geek. We're going to civil engineer geek a little bit.
That's
So
okay.
so this water treatment plant that is intact, their backup line. This is the when the zombie apocalypse happens, right? When everything goes to shit. Here's our backup line. It's a 36-inch pipe buried 30 feet in the ground, covered with concrete. This is the when everything goes wrong. We'll never use this pipe, right? This is engineered like, in fact, probably at the time, people are like, hey, this is overkill. Like, we're spending way too much money on this. That got washed away. Washed away.
Right.
30 feet in the ground, buried in concrete, washed away. So, engineering hat on, are we going to start shifting? Do we need to start shifting design standards to say, hey, what we thought was 1,000-year event
Yeah.
might be a 10-year event?
Or more frequent. I mean, just like you said, look at Tampa right now,
Mm-hmm,
speak as we're recording. I think the thing that I also think about, KP, is like, and I love that we're, you know, talking about human lives, right? And the impact that it's having on people's ability just to get fresh, clean water, to have,
mm-hmm,
and I'm rereading again McCarthy's The Road, right? I don't know why I'm
mm-hmm,
feeling so apocalyptic, but I don't mean to make light of it, but it's like sometimes it's just like your mind goes to these dark places as it relates to
mm-hmm,
climate, and then I come back and I say, okay, all right, let's put our tech hat back on. What can the real estate industry be doing, KP, to, both on the consumer side, but also like, our audiences that
mm-hmm.
we share in common, the big real estate companies, multifamily office logistics, how should they be thinking about the next, phase of life and the built environment? Because I mean, you can't put a dome over these structures. So how do you
Mm-hmm.
think about just practical mitigation today and steps
Yeah.
that we should be taking or thinking about?
Yeah. So I think there's a couple of things we've got to think about. One is, I think we need to just park the why. Like, I think we're done with
I
arguing
don't
about
even want
why.
to talk about the
Who
why.
cares about why,
I don't
right?
talk about the why anymore. It's
and
happening. It's in real time.
I'm almost like, let's forget about prevention. There's nothing to
Okay.
prevent, right?
Right. Right.
So now we start thinking about, like we talk about the housing crisis, and one of the answers to the housing crisis has been, hey, we could do more modular. We should do more modular. Maybe we should be thinking about modular that we can pick up and move,
Right.
right? Like, hey, this flood's going to come in and we need to move or you need to be able to replace. Like, okay, that went away.
Mhm.
Kind of like what we do with cars. You total a car and then they
Mhm.
give you replacement value. And so maybe you buy a prefab house, and if something happens, you get
Right.
replacement value, and a crane shows up and drops another one. And so I think we have to think about that. There's another bigger idea that I think will be very controversial is maybe we need to abandon these places with climate risk and turn them into green spaces, which is somewhat controversial, right? But then claim places that have been designated as green spaces and turn those into like commercial. So I'm almost saying, like, do we take a national forest and commercialize it? Which I love national forests, but we also need to think about humanity. Maybe we commercialize a national forest and then reallocate a climate risk area as the new national forest.
Love that. It's a great idea. Great idea. Well, I think you're seeing some of that already take place in places like Lower Manhattan with the Big U, which Bjarke Ingels firm is working on, which is a big storm resiliency infrastructure project. And it's just a ton of green space that they're dedicating to Lower Manhattan. But I think the other thing that's happening just in our mutual industries, the built environment is I mean, I'm sure you're seeing it. I see every day now this heightened sense of awareness that this accelerating climate crisis has really profoundly reoriented a lot of the thinking of the real estate owners and managers that climate risk from a financial point of view, yes, let's address the human aspect, which is really important, of course. But like if we put on not but and if we put on our business hats the shit's getting real in terms of being able to get insurance if you're in
Mm-hmm.
any of these sort of flood fire um, drought zones. um, the shit's getting real with the grid
Mm-hmm.
and being able to get power to a lot of these properties. So I think we're moving beyond a sort of like, hey, did you know the built environment 40% of all carbon emissions, and then hey, just awareness or prevention into like now what are you going to do because you're literally financially at huge amounts of risk in the built environment unless you address some of these problems. I mean, I've just seen these horror stories about consumers trying to get insurance to repair their home. It's not happening. Can't get
No,
insurance in California. Not happening. And now we're talking about the commercial insurers. It's getting increasingly hard. So I think the financial realities, not diminishing the human lives and the impact on people's livelihood, but the financial shit's getting real too, big time.
no, 100%. So, I used to always joke around where, like, for my investor base, I've never really liked having real estate investors as my LPs.
Mm.
And people would say, like, why? I'm like, well, they're coming off this 10-year boom of tech, and, anybody with the checkbook was a genius, so to speak. But real estate investors, their psychology, they don't understand the idea of an asset value going to zero,
Right.
right? They don't develop 10 multifamily properties and hope that one is successful and nine go to zero, right? That's not how they think. And so it's
Are you are
hard
you
for them.
speaking from the venture perspective?
Yeah, from a venture perspective, they can't understand our model,
Yeah, I know.
and they also don't, because they're in the finance world, they don't trust us enough to just say, hey, it's a different sport. I don't get it, but here's some money. So I've kind of shied away from having real estate people as LPs on my venture fund. But guess what? They do have asset values now going to zero,
Yeah.
right? Florida, I have several LPs that own a ton of multifamily property in Florida, struggling with insurance. their premiums have gone up 3, 4, 5x, and they can't pass that down to their tenants right away. They're going to try to build it into the rent for the next lease cycle. Hopefully, the market will sustain that, right? So I think we now have a business like real estate that has a risk of, they maybe need to start thinking like a venture model.
Yeah. Yeah, you're spot on to that. I would just again ask you, because you and I think also both share a passion for storytelling. And your event is amazing. I try to make it every year. It's just terrific. Um, so how do you think about, the messages today that will resonate to sort of, because if we're both looking for sort of a collective action and we're looking for because we care about the environment, we understand the built environment's got a role to play here, and it could potentially play not just a defensive role, but an offensive role, right? So how do you think about framing the conversation today when you're
Yeah,
out storytelling? What are the things you talk about that really get people to understand what's at stake? How do you frame it?
I think what I'm really focused on is engineers solve problems. Carbon credit accounting is not actually a problem, right? So
You don't have to bring
I
up.
think I have been leading the charge of saying engineers need to start leading everything in the built environment. If the architects want to make it look pretty, cool. You go sit over there and make it look pretty. If the
Yeah,
contractors want to build something cheaper, but fantastic. But I really believe that a lot of these problems are like engineering problems. I think there's a second piece too that engineers even need to learn for, like civil engineers and mechanical, we need to learn from, is we have now have to have more of a systems engineering approach. In other words, if you're designing for seismic or wind or whatever, let's say wind, for your new skyscraper, it's not about your individual skyscraper. It's about everything around you. So
right.
if you were running simulations for 2 or 3 blocks in every direction, all this stuff is one big ecosystem. It's highly connected. So when you see like a dam built for such and such failure, it doesn't factor in other watershed. Like they're not thinking about a systems approach, right? So I think the role of like urban planning has been highly focused on the people and things like that. Now I think we need to think about it's almost like this weird butterfly effect. If there's a climate event in Toronto, how does it affect Dallas, Texas? Because it probably does. There is something, right? And then I think as we think about infrastructure spend, we might need to have like backup emergency roads and emergency tunnels. And, like back to my water treatment plant example, that was their backup, it's like their third line of defense, right? And so what that means is we're going to now start designing and building infrastructure that's going to be more expensive with a lot of more of these things in mind. I mean, you think about like Tampa right now, everybody's trying to evacuate over the same highway.
Yeah, for
Like, I
days.
mean, for that, it just doesn't. You can't. So it used to be like, well, you can't design a road for these surge events that happen every 100 years. Oh, now we're going to need 12-lane roads, both directions, just in case.
Yeah. It's why, honestly, I always pay attention to what you're doing and the AEC marketplace, but with a more heightened sense of awareness for me personally. A lot of my building at Cretech in terms of the quote unquote, which I hate that expression, but I wound up using it by default, the prop tech community has largely been focused on, the office sector, owner operators, developers, but increasingly I'm really, really paying attention to the construction sector and the engineering sector as well, obviously, because I think therein lies the solutions. Like we're not going to SaaS our way to a solution
Right.
or to some kind of mitigation. I mean, it's important to understand the risk, understand a lot of the ways to operate buildings better. Um, but we're going to have to, like you said, KP, we're going to have to design and construct. I don't want to say our way out of this because there's no way out of it. Uh, to solutions that will enable, because the built environment's not going anywhere. Like,
Right.
it's not an industry that's going to disappear. We have to live in and work in structures, right? I mean, where's all this shit from Amazon coming out of, right? We need
Hmm.
warehouses, of course, and you're the guru. We need AI and we need data centers. But increasingly, I'm convinced it's the construction sector, right, that has
Hmm.
to come up with these solutions.
Hmm.
And that I think is where, I don't want to say the excitement, because it's not excitement that we should be framing this discussion on, but I think that's where the hope is. And I
Hmm.
also say, to put a lot of pressure, and I know you do a ton of mentoring on this next generation. I think the best talent is coming into climate tech and trying to figure this out. I know you speak at a lot of universities. I know you do a lot of mentoring. I've been doing a lot of speaking at the, not just the biggest brand name schools, but a lot of schools. And it's where these kids want to go because they're
Hmm.
terrified. So
Yeah.
that's where at least I find, I don't want to say hope, but I find answers.
Yeah. No, I agree with you. And it's interesting when I talk to these young folks and they want to get into, call it sustainability and
We
climate.
sound like two old farts, man. We
Oh
do
my God. These
not
kids
young
today,
folks, but they
we're
all.
like we're like those two guys on the
I
Muppets up on the
know
balcony. No, these kids today.
these
Um,
kids. Yeah,
but you know what I'm finding out is that they're their signals about like what's actually happening in the marketplace, they view as like borderline fraud. Like
totally,
we're not solving any problems,
totally.
right? We're not like, oh, like great, I'm gonna go work for some software company that's in sustainability or work for the sustainability department at a construction company. No one's actually solving any problems. It's all this compliance, right? So now, like to your point, like the real estate market, now they have to figure out how to pencil out deals.
Yeah.
They're going to cost twice as much. That are going to have different infrastructure that maybe they didn't think about designing before. So they can't go to their engineering firm and say, "Remember those last 10 office buildings we designed? Just do another one." Right? It's going to be, oh no, like we have to go back to the drawing board, and somehow we've got to make the financial numbers work to make it work, and then also that the banks and all that finance all this stuff can understand what's why is this new building twice as much per foot? This doesn't make sense. um, and I just don't know if those markets can move fast enough to really understand that these events will cost us more in infrastructure. The last thing I'll bring up is that we've got to understand, this is like the best country in the world, worst country in the world, right? We've got to figure out our consumption. So much of what we don't need as many trucks on the road if we can stop consuming as much. So if forget about the consumption in terms of impact, like what it costs to produce a good, like, to the environment. Once again, I'm like almost zero focused on preventative right now. My brain's just not there. But when you sit there in a major intersection, artery of an interstate, and you see how many Amazon trucks and how many Walmart trucks, we've got to figure out how to like not be using all this infrastructure. And that could be like, let's reduce consumption, right?
Well, I think it's why, and I know you spent time in Europe, and you talk about circularity, so much more of that in other places of the world than here in the US, which, I think if I mentioned circularity to the rank and file, I think they'd be like, what the hell is that? But I think it's changing. I think the other thing that's on my mind, KP, love to get your thoughts on, is like, I just been hearing for years and years about we need this green discount. I actually think, the contrarian probably is always, that I think consumers and businesses will pay more for more durable, if there's such a word, climate properties, apartments, structures, buildings. I think there's people will be willing to pay a premium because of what they're seeing actually happen today in real time, with the crisis. Like, I don't think we should be keep waiting for this discount. I really think the pendulum's going to swing, and that companies and people will pay again. I understand there's economic hardship. I'm not minimizing that, but I think people will pay more because I think the next headline, and I'm sad to say it, is like the migration out of Florida. I think people are just they can't survive anymore. They're the cost to just to repair to get insurance. I think that we're going to see this pendulum swim backwards, and I think people will pay if, like you said, give me a modular house if I have to pay a little bit more, but I can move it around or I could. What do you think about this sort of notion of a green disc, looking for the green discount? I think I think
I
it's
just think like maybe green sustain, like maybe all those narratives were relevant in prevention mode.
right. Yeah.
I don't think that's where we're at anymore. And look, there's some other. I was talking to a resilience expert, and she told me that 6 weeks after a major event, we saw this. By the way, I did forensics work for Katrina. I was on the ground post Katrina, running simulations on things, and she mentioned to me, she's like, 6 weeks after a major event, the clock starts, and every week after the first 6 weeks, people don't return. So, for example, in Asheville right now, they're saying schools are closed indefinitely. So
Wow.
people pick up and they move to their with their in-laws, their parents, in another city, with friends in another city. They put their kids in school. They're there for like, oh, we're just gonna be here for a month or two. Kids make friends, kids get acclimated. You don't go back. I mean, post Katrina, I don't know what the numbers are. Maybe someone can look it up. Any of y'all that are listening, go look it up and post it in the chat. But the amount of migration that happened from New Orleans to Atlanta and Houston was massive, to the point that like people evacuated to those cities and they never left. I don't know
Yeah.
if you remember Anastasia, who used to work for me. She was one of those people. She grew up in New Orleans.
Yeah.
Parents evacuated to Atlanta and she never left.
Yeah.
That's why at an Atlanta Falcons football game,
Yeah.
the fan base is half. When the Saints show up, there's almost more Saints fans than there are Falcons fans. Well, one, it's like impossible to be a Falcons fan. It's just like terrible. But there's more Saints fans, and people are like, why are there more Saints fans than there are Falcons? Like, we had that whole migration of New Orleans people.
Amazing. I think you know, where if we turn the doom and gloom, which is real, not minimizing it, I do believe that, I was at and I know you were too, you were up in New York during Climate Week, and I didn't go to any of this sort of, it's just a, for me, there's just too, we don't have time to be focusing, at least me, on sort of greenwashing and theory,
Mm-hmm.
goals and targets and collective action. It's great. It's important. It's not where my
Mm-hmm.
head's at. My head always goes back to tech. And I think during Climate Week, I spent a lot of time with a couple climate venture firms and startups. And I do think that there's hope in that. Again, we're not going to solve the problem, but as best we can mitigate it and build some kind of resiliency. I do think that the tech sector is responding.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know, that's where I find some degree of hope. What
Yeah,
do you think about that?
yeah, I do think that the tech sector is responding in a way, right? But I think there's two patterns that I'm not excited about in the tech sector. One, that and there's some issues with with my world of venture capital, right? You
Some
operate a
issues?
tank.
Some issues?
Some issues, not for me, for everyone else. No,
No.
but there's some basic like foundational thing. A venture fund is meant to last for 10 years and deliver returns.
Right.
Any big idea needs more than 10 years. Two, founders, due to a lack of capital, they tend to take a big idea and make it very mediocre. So
Mhm.
if they say, I need $50 million to start my company to solve a massive problem, the VC community goes back and it's like, well, what if we did a seed round of five instead of 50? So then the entrepreneurs go back to the drawing board. Okay, what can I do with five? So a big idea gets chopped down to a highly mediocre idea because unfortunately, some of the velocity in venture capital is driven by you need to get to revenue next year.
Right.
Well, I'm sorry, like the biggest, we need to start thinking like pharma.
Mhm.
Pharma doesn't say, oh, we're going to find a cure for cancer tomorrow and you need to show revenue next year, right? So I think there's some um, issues with with the venture capital community as it looks to this sector around time horizons and the amounts of capital, which also starts to drive the culture and behavior of the founders that are passionate. They're passionate about a problem, but they feel like, hey, if I can get $5 million, I'll go chip away at the problem. But they spend 5 years building a mediocre company.
Okay, so given that, and again, that's your world, the investment community, and that's where you've spent so much of your career so successfully. I'm a founder. I've got an idea. Other than venture, where and let's say it's hardware. Venture doesn't love hardware because it's too
Right.
complicated. Maybe the return horizon's too long, too much risk. They're risk averse, a lot of them, not all of them, to hardware. Where am I going to get my capital to build this climate tech solution? So if I'm not going to go to traditional venture, where am I going?
Yeah. I mean, I think today you are going to go get research grants. You're going to go to NIST and NSF and all the different, and cobble together 5 and 10 million through research grants. You're going to go to foundations and get money. It's a totally different, like, once again, much like pharma.
Yeah.
Um, when you're, so we look at investing, we say there's technical risk and market risk. Um, Nobody in pharma says, what's the market opportunity for a cure for breast cancer? No, nobody asks that. It's like, of course, like
What's
the,
the TAM? Right.
what's the TAM, right? Nobody asks that question, right? All the money goes into technical risk. Can you actually solve the problem? How many millions before you can solve the problem? And then can you produce it, right? Maybe I can create, the cure for cancer, but I can only do it at a scale of 10 doses a year. Well, that's not that helpful, right? So how do I scale these things? And so I think it's taking a shift of thinking, which if you follow that pattern, a lot of it's tied to university research and grants, and there's an R&D um, cycle that lasts 3 to 5 years, and then there's a commercialization cycle. And I used to run the incubator at Georgia Tech, so you know half of my portco was like life sciences, right? So I saw it firsthand, and there is capital available for that. But I think most founders, their first reaction is to like, oh, let me go pitch a VC. One of my portfolio companies, Aaron, who's based in New York, they do AI for evaluating infrastructure like bridges and roads and things like that. They've done really well with getting grant funding because they were a spin out of Cornell.
Yeah, I think that's great. That's great insight. What about corporate? I know you spend a lot of time with big corporates in the AC marketplace. Are they a source for investing these days? The big construction companies, the big engineering companies, how are they approaching sort of incubating a lot of these ideas?
They are, but I think they're not thinking big enough either, right? A lot of my LPs are these corporates, right? As you said, I spent a lot of time with these folks. They're looking at things. What the great what was that movie? Any given Sunday, Al Pacino says like 5 inches in front of your helmet kind of stuff, right? It's that kind of stuff that they're focused on. Oh, how do we improve job site safety? How do we improve? Nobody's saying like let's deploy capital to reinvent an entire industry.
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
That's where I do see, other than you and a few others, I do see some real good innovation, and real critical minds and thinking coming from outside of our industry. I do see that. I see some incredibly successful entrepreneurs that had no connection or history in the built environment coming in, either from a venture perspective or from a startup and technology solution. And those are the ones that I'm really getting kind of
yeah,
jazzed about. One of the things also that I also, I'm sort of I feel it's coming, but just this lack of awareness about grid risk. And I know it's something you talk about and you have a great deal of knowledge about. Like, I think the other message to the built environment is like, okay, maybe you don't own any assets in, in currently where a lot of the destruction's happening, and maybe you're in a location that doesn't suffer from such risk, physical from climate. But how about the grid? Is the grid
Mhm.
going to be able to generate power to your structure? Increasingly, I'm hearing these horror stories about no, but I don't know that that's widespread, but it's something I think about a lot in terms of another big risk as a sort of impact to the built environment with climate is you know has a role in this, but it's also just the grid is just too old, it's too outdated, it's too antiquated. How do you think about grid risk today?
Yeah, like I'll tell you, like we have our summit coming up, but I've started hosting these like 25-person think tank
Great.
type
Yeah.
deals with executives, and we're hosting one in November that is all about this, right? We look the utilities were struggling, so think pre data center boom, they were already struggling to deliver,
That's the point. Right.
right? Now we're throwing additional throughput onto the grid. So I think as we think about rebuilding the grid, as we think about, I saw one pitch from a company where they're talking about battery farms that sit. It's kind of interesting. Let's put them at the top of the building, put about farms of batteries, like a server farm, but with batteries. And in fact, that weight of batteries will keep the building from swaying. So
Mm.
you have like that weight up there, but that the building should be able to sustain itself somewhat independently off grid when need be. But they're talking about weeks at a time, not
Right.
so. I would say like 3 weeks ago when they pitched me this idea, which is just an idea, I was like, I don't know about all that. And now I'm like, hey guys, you want to talk? Like,
Yeah.
right? Like, um, because what do you do, right? You start thinking about that. So we've got to have a way. Like, I think rebuilding a grid is not a trivial task. I'm sitting here in Silicon Valley right now, and it's like PG&E serves this market. They were struggling before
Yeah.
all of this stuff, right? So
Yeah.
so so now you start thinking about these things, and you say, well, um, if you think about how we dealt with compute, right? So computing and pre-internet, post-internet, and how we think about distributed computing. I think we have to, we think about edge networks with data, like, to have data closer to the user. I think we're going to have to start thinking about much more complex distributed energy, which might be back to, we're now in problem solving mode. Maybe every house should have batteries or power gen. They can last a month or two
Right.
months, right?
Right.
And I'm not trying to be doomsday prepper, but also if these are not just backup systems, but they're also, I read this great article. There's once again, maybe somebody can use the internet for us, but there's a city in Africa that gets all their power off of hydroelectric.
Mhm.
So the problem has been like, it's great. We have free power, like infinite power in a way, but we don't have a way to store and distribute it. So now they're giving all their citizens highly subsidized EV equipment, batteries, things like that, because they're saying it's not about generation, it's about storage, right? So I think we have to start thinking about not storing energy as a backup, as a resilience play, but maybe we should all be running batteries and being able, and it all needs to look more like distributed computing, like back in the internet days. Back in the internet days, and we're running off 28.8 modems. A T1 was a big deal, right? But we're trying to push video and do all these things. So we had to go into, like, if the data analogy is we ran caching servers. So there were companies like Akamai and all that set servers at the edge, and we cached content so that you didn't have to constantly hit servers, right? So do you think of batteries that way as like caching power to use it when you need it versus always hitting the grid? So I mean, once again, I think the engineering community, the traditional engineering community in the AEC space and utilities have to start thinking about the systems architecture of our neighborhood cities and country
Yeah.
versus like sitting in in a vacuum somewhere.
Well, I mean, just to sort of put a ribbon on it, maybe, or put a bow on it. I mean, let's listen. We're in a capitalistic society here in the U.S., and the question I always get, well, who's paying for it, right? I mean, these are hard costs. These are CapEx dollars. This is, at a time where the office market's struggling, interest rates super high, supply chain issues. I mean, there's a lot of stress in the system. What I sort of talk about the financial opportunities. I mean, if it's a $2 trillion market every year for the next 10 years, whatever the number is, 20 trillion, 30 trillion, there's just huge upside too to those that are investing. Yes, we're talking about preserving life and preserving buildings and properties and investment. I just keep going back to, okay, if I can't motivate you based on just the physical risk and being, completely wiped out in terms of your investment, how about the upside? And I think
Mhm.
I don't think there's anything wrong with saying that, by the way.
No, no, no. No, I think there's massive, massive opportunities, right? And back to they're all very capex intensive,
I know. And it
right?
has to be
But they're all
smart.
very capex intensive.
Yeah.
Even everybody's very excited about nuclear.
Yep.
I always joke around. When I graduated from college, I worked on Plant Vogtle. I'm now 53 years old. They just turned Vogtle on this year
Hmm.
in Georgia. It takes a minute. There's actually not a lot of talent in the nuclear space because it wasn't a market for so long. So we have a massive issue with talent around nuclear power gen. So all these things take time. Big things take time, and I think I think we just there will be massive, massive opportunities, and I do think we need to start thinking about being more inventive. We need to think about, I always joke around like, I remember I built out my first data center in 1998, and I had a terabyte of storage at my data center from EMC. Cost me like $5 million, right? You can get that on a thumb drive now, and so it's super interesting to think about like how if given infinite resources like hard drive space, we just tend to store a bunch of stuff that we don't actually need. So
I know,
anyway,
man.
man, I know we're kind of at time, and this has been a fantastic conversation, and I'm sure.
Always enjoy talking with you, KP. And I learned so much with every interaction. And I hope those that are listening had some takeaways from this. And I just always invite everybody to follow KP. Great thought leadership, great content, great information. Come see him at CRETEC, New York, November. And the Shadow event is one of my all-time favorites. It's where you can really get into it's sort of the uncreate event. My team's gonna kill me because you can have like intimate conversations with people where it's, we're going the other way at scale because we got a lot of mouths to feed in the ecosystem.
Yeah,
You're much more.
I think I told you like it was very controversial when I took Summit and took it from 300 to 100.
I know, man.
People are, and I tell people like I'm not in the event business.
I
That's a
know,
great
man.
that's the facts, right? That I am not in the event business because you would never decrease your attendance limit by a third.
I don't know. We're
Oh, there's
toying with
just too
some
many people.
ideas.
There's too many
I'll
people.
just
I've seen
tease
it.
that. I'll tease that for a minute. We're toying with some of those ideas, borrowing from you, because I know you run a great event. But man, I just appreciate all of the thought leadership and the the ideas that are coming out of you and your colleagues. And because this we're not going to wish our way out of this crisis. It's not cyclical. It's forever. Like one of the things that I read, I don't know, and it's not like earth shattering. It's like this is the new baseline, right? Like it's not like a marketplace where interest rates or cap rates or leasing velocity. It's not cyclical. Like this is the baseline. So imagine a year from now when we're having this conversation, what we're talking about, right? I can't even imagine. So, but there is hope, and I think the sooner that we can start to encourage these new ideas, invest in these new ideas, I think the can lessen whatever the impact is to some degree. But anyway, always enjoy it, buddy.
All right, man.
Thanks
Great
everybody
seeing
for
you.
listening.